Okay, so what's your body? It works. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to present my work here. Let's have a look at contemporary Europe. Looking over the political scene of contemporary Europe, we observe that democracy and liberal institutions are still in force in Great Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, the Scandinavian countries of Sweden, Norway, Denmark and Finland, and in Czechoslovakia, while autocracies at present embrace Russia, Turkey, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Austria, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania and Hungary. As for Spain and Greece, notwithstanding that democratic constitutions are nominally still in existence, it is at least open to doubt whether or not they at the present moment should be classified as democracies. So those of you who were listening watchfully might have discovered some dissonance in my introduction. It's not only due to Czechoslovakia, but maybe I'm not sure if you agreed on the fact that Austria, Poland or Germany can be called autocratic systems at the moment. What I just introduced you are not my own words. It's a quotation of Karl Löwenstein, who was a lawyer and political scientist, and who can be called the godfather of militant democracy. And the quotation is from an article published in 1935, while here the picture I just showed is from 2010. The article was called Autocracy versus Democracy in Contemporary Europe. So we should maybe spend a second to think about how contemporary this article is today, almost 80 years after it was written. Aren't we facing a deep economic crisis throughout Europe right now? And don't we remember some news from Hungary that the government restricts media and freedom of speech? Maybe you have heard the story of the banning of an extremist right-wing party in the Czech Republic. And just a few days ago, we heard from a survey in Germany that found some 9% of German society to have an extreme right view of the world. And what about democracy in Russia in the third term of President Putin? What about democracy in Italy after 11 years altogether of Prime Minister called Berlusconi? What about political parties of Vlaamsbelang in the Belgian parliament? What about Batasuna in Spain? What about Geert Wilders' Party for the Freiheit in the Netherlands? What about the Freiheitliche Partei in Austria? And what about the True Finns in Finland? And so on. So in my presentation, I will focus on the findings of my research project called the European Union as a Militant Democracy. And first, I will introduce the so-called democratic dilemma as well as the concept of militant democracy. Second, I'm going to give you a brief overview on the legal responses to political extremism in Europe. And this covers three levels. First, the constitutions of the member states of the European Union. Second, the European Convention of Human Rights. And then, of course, the Treaty of the European Union itself. And finally, as a conclusion, I will present some results and recommendations. So, is freedom a threat to democracy? If we allow for too much freedom in a democratic system, then it might be abused to destroy democracy. On the other hand, if we restrict freedom too much in order to defend democracy, then we're going to destroy democracy ourselves. And this is called the democratic dilemma. So democracy is not a weak system, but it has to be defended actively. And from my personal point of view, the first and strongest line of defense is the level of the citizens and their very own conviction that they want to live in freedom and democracy. So what we need is not only militant democracies, but militant democrats, if you want. So I could stop here because that's the point, but we'll not talk about political practice, which is a second important line of defense, and of course my own research focuses on a third line of defense, that is the legal instruments of militant democracy. What is militant democracy? I just want to give you a short introduction and a brief definition, which was written by Leuphana, a Czech scientist, recently. According to that, militant democracy can be defined as a democratic regime that takes active steps to defend its constitutional and political values through the use of repressive legal instruments and other measures. It opposes free activity and the influence of movements that wish to replace the democratic constitutional regime with another type of regime. So I was comparing the constitutions of constitutional orders of the member states of the European Union. And by doing so, I checked the indicators of militant democracy. And the most well-known indicators maybe are the prohibition of banning political parties or a constitutional core that can or cannot be modified legally, but of course there's some other indicators too. And maybe I have to point out that for this comparison it doesn't matter if a democratic order labels itself a militant democracy or not. So after doing this, we find 4 categories of non-militant or militant democracies. And one point is maybe important to that. It's not 4 strict categories, but it's more like a continuum of militant democracy. So it could be a little bit more like this or a little bit more like that. And I would just point out some features here. Among the member states of the European Union, there are democracies which decisively do not impose any legal restrictions to modifications of their constitutional core, including the democratic principle, such as Ireland or the Netherlands. And combined with a lack of specific instruments to restrict action of anti-democratic movements, they cannot be called militant democracies, at least from a legal point of view. And then there are countries that have qualified at least some basic elements to defend a democratic order of the state. However, the real protection is then not so much exerted by law, but by the political process, like for example in Italy, or by a pardon sanitaire in Belgium, or by the supremacy of parliament in combination with the majority voting system in the United Kingdom, for example. Some other democracies clearly provide for defensive mechanisms, just to mention anti-fascist laws of Italy or Austria, but even more those countries which have introduced a systematic framework of elements of militant democracy, like for instance Poland, Portugal, Germany, or the Czech Republic. Spain and Greece are maybe interesting here because they don't want to label themselves militant democracy because they perceive militant democracy as a system which restricts democracy itself. So it's not perceived as a protection, but something negative. But I don't want to go into detail here. And maybe another interesting point, Turkey has implemented its options in an extensive way that raises doubt. It is said that 17 political parties have been banned between 1991 and 2001. And an overall number of 154 parties since the Republic was proclaimed. So therefore Turkey has sometimes been called the graveyard of political parties. Let's have a look at some main results of my comparison. Just to show you, when we are going to map militant democracies in Europe, we find maybe a bit of a surprise, as militant democracy is oftentimes perceived as a German model to deal with political extremism. We find that a provision on banning political parties has spread throughout Europe. Those countries more in deeper orange have introduced this instrument in their constitutional order, the others have it in other legal orders. But it's not always like that. Maybe a provision on prohibiting the abuse of fundamental rights has not spread everywhere in Europe, and interestingly is concentrated in the southeastern part of Europe, just to show you there's some difference of the instruments. And there is a clear correlation of the experience of dictatorship and the introduction of instruments of militant democracy. As you can see here, the red countries and the orange countries, you can maybe called militant or rather militant democracies. And we also see that the relatively younger democracies in the mid-European and Eastern European countries, for example, the Czech Republic, Poland, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, have more or less introduced this idea into their constitution. Okay, so let's take the next step. What about structures of militant democracy on the European level? We should keep in mind that all of the member states of the European Union have ratified the European Convention of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. I will, okay. Maybe I become an extremist and take some too long. Okay. But maybe I can keep it short on the European Convention since we have Zarowski here, who's an expert in this, I think. We'll see. Just one point. I think the convention is regarded as a minimum standard of fundamental rights, and so I would claim that if you find elements, or maybe even an effective system of militant democracy in the convention, then this should be regarded as a minimum standard of the protection of European democracies. The two most important articles here, I just can't mention them. Maybe important is that the main criterion for restricting fundamental rights in order to defend democracy is that it has to be necessary in a democratic society. So it is only a last resort and not a means of the regular political process. Okay. I'll just give you one citation of judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, which is important since the court thereby defines the limits of freedom and democracy. And he declares it declares that a state cannot be required to wait before intervening until a political party has seized power and begun to take concrete steps to implement a policy incompatible with the standards of the Convention on Democracy. And even more explicit, the court calls on the principle of militant democracy in the case of Streitbare against Latvia in 2006. And this was about the right to be elected for public offices, which had been restricted for former communists. In order to guarantee the stability and effectiveness of a democratic system, the state may be required to take specific measures to protect itself. Otherwise, the state would neglect its duty to effectively uphold democratic structures. Okay, let me just spend 1 or 2 minutes on the law of the European Union itself, and only on the most important instrument here. The core values of the EU are fixed in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union, and it says the Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities, which is included. However, there is a mechanism to protect these values, and that is codified in Article 7. There's a two-level mechanism. On the first level, the Union may determine that there is a clear risk of a serious breach of those values by a member state. But if the situation gets worse in this member state, then the Union may determine the existence of a serious and persistent breach of these values. And then the Council may decide to suspend certain of the rights deriving from the application of the treaties, including the voting rights of the representative of the government of the member state in the Council. So it becomes clear that the Union has stipulated the idea of protecting democracy and fundamental freedoms, both by instruments of prevention and restriction. Okay, to sum up, I will keep it short and provide 5 results and 5 recommendations. A series of democracies, as we see them, label themselves as militant democracies, and there are a lot of different forms and characteristics of how to protect democracy. However, by comparing legal responses to political extremism, we find that the idea of militant democracy has spread widely throughout the Union. Then, as I said, there's a striking correlation of constitutional history, the experience of dictatorship, and the strength of militant democracy. And maybe one point, the concept of militant democracy has to be updated to current challenges. So it's not only meant traditionally as protecting against challenges from inside the political system, but also from any other direction as well. The law of the European Convention of Human Rights, as applied by the European Court of Human Rights, should be regarded as a common European minimum standard of protecting democracy. And the Union holds their specific mechanisms of prevention and repression, while it hasn't been applied so far. So even if you don't catch it in detail now, this is how a European system of militant democracy could look like, but maybe we can discuss this further afterwards. But one point is important. We should think about how to integrate those instruments of the European Convention on Human Rights with the instruments of the constitutional orders of the member states, with the Treaty of the European Union. So therefore we get a working system of militant democracy on a European level. We're not lacking instruments for protecting democracy, but rather their application. So it's most important to apply militant democracy means it's necessary. For the Union, we could introduce some missing instruments, like maybe effective democracy monitoring as combined with Article 7, or maybe a party ban provision, which doesn't exist on the European level right now. Militant democracy must be a last resort. And it's nice to have legal instruments, but that's not sufficient to keep democracy alive. So we need to protect democracy through the regular political process and through the support of the citizens in the first place. And here, let me just add one more word to the economic crisis. We should not think only about the crisis too much, but also about how to deal with political extremism and the challenges to democracy from a common European point of view. So I want to argue that militant democracy is not the cause of the democratic dilemma, but rather an answer to solve this dilemma. And if there is such thing as common European values, then we should think about how to protect these values. And the idea of defending substantial democracy on a common European level would be a good, but as well a necessary step towards this. Thank you.